So in any case, I wanted you to know that the community will indeed be well represented, and it will be used as a source of scholarship for students and scholars in the future that wish to write about the Italian Canadian community in Canada, but especially in Ottawa. So for that, all of us should be proud. Also, what I wish to do this evening is, rather than speaking of, and those of you that will read the book, will find the book and read the book, will find that it's not a book really about the families of the community. It is a book that wishes to speak, if you see the table of contents. In the first place, we have the table of contents of, we have the two prefaces, one by our former mayor, regional chair, and now current candidate again for mayor, Bob Sharadli. And we also have Trina, who was extremely kind and exceptional. I mean, no one gives more of her heart or her time to the Italian community. No one gives more of herself. And I cannot be prouder to have someone as her, as my source. Whenever I needed anything, and any time day or night, I would call and say, Trina, where do I find it? And 2 days later, it would be there. The book then goes on to have my own preface and an introduction. And then we see, I wanted to take the Italian community all the way back to its origins. And this is what I will be doing this evening. In your standard readings, an author will probably take 2 or 3 pages from the book and read. Purtroppo qui non lo posso fare in italiano perché il libro è stato scritto in inglese per ovvi motivi. The book was written in English because I wanted it to have access worldwide, not simply to a restricted community. So I beg your forgiveness for that, but that's fine. Also, too, this was supposed to be the first of 2 or 3 books. This book wished to speak of beginnings, the community, early migration to Ottawa. It wanted to view the community, what builds a community. And to build a real community, you simply do not need people. You need institutions. You need religion. You need social groups. You need people who build, constructors. You need restaurateurs. You need the businessmen. You eventually need long-term care. Because eventually all these young people need to be taken care of somewhere. And I am one of them at the moment, which is why I won't be doing a second book, because my health just won't allow it at the moment. But a second book then would have gone beyond the Preston Street today and the rest of it, and would have spoken of the families. This is an idea that Trina and I had. We would have a much bigger book, perhaps a table volume book, one of those picture books where one will speak of the individual families and all their achievements. I will try. I don't know if I'll be able to complete something like that, but we will try. That would be a second phase of this type of study. And then also in the book, I speak of the possible overall future prospects for the street that we call Preston. But in any case, this is the settlement on the Ottawa River in 1632 by Samuel de Champlain. Ottawa is right there, number 77. Cars, trucks, heavy transports bustle down the busy thoroughfare that we know as Preston Street. It is a vital link, a highway between the province of Quebec and Ontario. The traffic is always deafening, swallowing up the street in rush hour madness. But once a year, the street assumes shades of its other, more benevolent half. The street becomes Corso Italian, alive with people, and motor traffic is supplanted by multitudes that saunter and play amongst food booths, glistening with roasted sausages, pop music. During the Italian event we know as Italian Week, 500,000 pairs of feet pound the pavement usually reserved for spinning tires. Other events throughout the year consolidate the status of Preston Street, not only as a motor thoroughfare, but as a pedestrian plaza. And so Preston Street, Corsa Italia, lives much like the Italian community, a schizophrenic nature, half transportation artery and a half pedestrian mall, not really knowing which is which, unless you're in the middle of the street and get hit by a truck. Or unless you're in the middle of the street and don't get hit by a truck, which you'll know you're during Italian. At any instant, the street is more than the eye can see, just like our community. More than any car can hear, just like our community. It has a value that reaches into the past and comes up to our present day. Every Italian that has ever lived in Ottawa has a certain, sometimes ambivalent association with Preston Street that we now market as Little Italy. The capital city of Ottawa is an environment of distinctive districts. For the most part, one usually knows where one is just by looking around oneself. Sandy Hill, turn of the century freehold, Victorian laced homes, nothing in common with the clapboard, shotgun, box architecture of Mechanicsville, though both were developed at the same time in the late 1800s. Nestled between the Rideau Canal, turn of the century business district, tree-lined streets of the Glebe are often considered to be the most nostalgic, charming, and livable streets of Ottawa. The grimier, shadier in character, and also economically, Vanier rests in the shade of the Parliament buildings, which doesn't say a lot for the Parliament buildings, does it? The Preston Street area displays characteristics that make it too a very distinctive neighborhood. I hate to say it, but the architecture is often uninspired, overpowering for its grayish drabness. This is, of course, the first superficial look of an outsider. Little in the street can be cited as aesthetically distinctive with any other environment. When I asked people on the street for a general description and impression of the Preston Street area, most said that it was missing something. When I pressed them further, they said, maybe it's missing a heart, a style. The recent sprouting of long block office towers has done little to give it a heart, and has done little to soften its concrete character. The creation of a food district by the locals, wishing to emulate the food district on Somerset Street as a prime feature in the area, has done little to really consolidate an Italian flavor because it has created more of an international flair, a place to go and eat, rather than a place to go and enjoy Italian cuisine. So Preston Street keeps getting itself on the head or on the toes with its own success at times. Preston Street is often physically described as formless. My pages seem to be sticking. Come on, let's go. Okay. Formless. An endless, uneven spread of restaurants, cleaners, old buildings, some funky upstart cafes, recent infill, iconic installations which make the street a go-to place for youngsters, hairdressers. Yet, the metaphorical and the symbolic personality and perceived identity of the street seems to be of a different nature. When pressed for information, people actually describe the street with family names, recognizable family names: Costantini, Mascioli, Piezzi. Older citizens who remember the 417 overpass as a railroad bridge spoke in more romantic terms of the area that they once knew as the village. Yes, that's it, the CNR Preston Street overpass. Some of the older fellows that I met on Sunday mornings would tell me of the snowballs they would throw from this overpass and all the fun they had. The fun they had dropping snowballs into train locomotive stacks. All in all, the Preston Street area is still considered, here it is when it had its trolley, is still considered an essential linear node, an edge of the city. Not really a part of Ottawa, but a place that one normally went to as you lowered yourself down the escarpment onto the flats. And believe me, it was considered that way, as you will see. Now, Preston Street was not always what we consider it to be today. And it was not part of the Ottawa cityscape. And it was not always a two-laned, cluttered thoroughfare. Not always called Little Italy. Preston Street derives its name from George H. Preston, a partner of William Young Rochester. Both had jointly purchased land in the Preston Street area in 1859. Both of them had the vanagloria, the vain glory, to wish to buy land and place their names on it. The parcels of land that they purchased eventually gave way to their names: Preston Street and Rochester Street. The two divided the area into lots. Those lots eventually became known as the village. It ideally extends between Preston Street and Gladstone Avenue, travels along Preston Street to the current day Carling Avenue. But we're rushing ahead in our story. We need to move back a bit. LeBreton Flats, always considered to be a part of Preston area, but it never really was. LeBreton Flats is just south of the river's edge on part of what was once called the Richmond Landing, because of the Richmond settlers who had once settled there, and also because it was the terminus, the Richmond Road, that began in the village of Richmond and ended in Ottawa. Hence, Richmond Road. This is the village of Richmond, around 1830. There is a natural bend in the river, right at the end of the terminus, which was formed by the rocks in the churning waters of the Chaudière Falls, which we all know very well. Impressive indeed. It was once called the Second Niagara Falls, a site that remains naturally dominating today, as it too goes through its Ibitibi and Tibi and its transformations into hotels and motels and yuppified living on islands. It should be quite beautiful there in 20 or 30 years in that area. Have nothing to do with Italian or anything, but it'll be very beautiful to live on those sites, I'm sure. The site was eventually purchased by John LeBreton of Nepean in December 1820. Now, Le Breton's intentions was to create a permanent settlement on the then very highly trafficked river. He wished to rival the settlement of Philemon Wright, which was located on the Hull side. So Hull already existed. Indeed, in the 1800s, Le Breton's settlement had grown to a burgeoning town on this side of the river. The spot was perfect for a new town, a new settlement. The challenging waterfalls impeded the progress of moving logs to sawmills and pump mills down the river. Therefore, the waterways that were leading to the falls was a perfect place to build a town. Why? Well, you just saw the Chaudray Falls, and now you're seeing the log jams right in front of the Chaudray Falls. Now, these fellows all need something to do while those logs are being moved onto the land and transported around the falls. And so, while these men transported the logs around the falls, it was obvious to Le Breton that he could build a town there, starting off with your local place for libation, beer, a tavern, place to sleep at night, the inn. And so as a few days would sometimes move into weeks, and the loggers would somehow meet the locals, many of them would remain local, and here you have the beginning of a town called Rochesterville. Not Ottawa, Rochesterville. So you see, these simple geographic. I always explain to my students, whenever you want to understand a people, look at their geography. What does it do? Does it make them wear coats? Does it make them skin animals? Does it make them grow tomatoes? Whatever it makes them do, whatever it constricts them to do, those are the people you are involved with. You're not going to find killers among people who grow candy cane. You'll find those among people who hunt lions and tigers and bears. And so you understand the geography. Well, the geography of this area, which is why many of you are here and not in Toronto and not in Montreal or in the warmer climes, because you're rugged people that are used to this kind of climate. Not that you enjoy being here, but you're here. If you hadn't enjoyed it, you would have gone to warmer places. Yeah. One never knows about Florida these days. So these loggers needed to wait their turns. Smelling profit and enterprising, Le Breton took advantage of the growing bottleneck by providing accommodation and very generous libation to the idle loggers who eventually settled in the area. The ambitious enterprise eventually caught the wind of the 9th Earl of Dalhousie, General George Ramsay, who was jealous of Le Breton because he too wanted to create his own town. Now, both Dalhousie and Le Breton were interested in the Richmond Landing. That landing that we have just seen that Le Breton had just turned into a small community. Both were stumbling over each other to find land that was for sale. Well, guess what? This land was for sale. 900 acres, 490 pounds. Le Breton beat Dalhousie to the courthouse, and Dalhousie never forgave him for it. Imagine Dalhousie's consternation when he realized that he had purchased the land. The two parted, and Dalhousie sought revenge. Well, viewed from Dalhousie's perspective, okay, the area, which is described here, is the situation is most beautiful, salubrious, being on the south side of the falls, a Grand Union Bridge abutting on the center, leading through Main Street, replete with mill sites, commerce, no situation on the river can equal it. The The subscriber is determined as much as possible to confine its sales to persons of respectability. These were the ads that were being published in local newspapers and across Canada for people to move to Canada, buy land, right? Well, in 1823, Dalhousie decided to buy land further upriver, Upper Town, today's Rockcliffe. His town was not to be down in the flats. His new town, that you could recognize now as Upper Town, okay? Remember, Upper Town, Lower Town, they all have reasons for their naming. Perched well above the Chaudet Falls. Dalhousie reserved the land for government use and set about to construct a village of his own. Well, obviously, Dalhousie had government patronage. He was a politician. And just like today, politicians have the ear of the prime minister, if not the king or the queen of the time. Right? Dalhousie reserved the land for government use. Here's an 1824 map drawn by Lord Dalhousie. It shows Lot 40. And there is Lot 40. Lot 40 carries the names of Le Breton and Sherwood. To the east is Lot C. Now, I'm speaking of this in detail because the Revelation will explain a lot about Ottawa to you. To the east is Lot C, which was owned at the time by Nicholas Sparks. Above Sparks' property is a lot marked government purchase, Dalhousie's property. But this was also, at the time, known as the Fraser property. And it was eventually purchased by Dalhousie. And that's the part of land that eventually became the village of Bytown. The development of this village, Bytown, was given to a colonel, John By, friend, business associate of guess who? Lord Dalhousie. The future growth of the city of Ottawa, that political town, it was essentially the future growth of the city of Bytown by Le Breton was essentially stifled by any possible real growth by the city of Bytown, which was practically handed over to the government by Lord Dalhousie. After considerable, now, in the meantime, 1826, Colonel By received orders that he was to build a canal that was navigable and stretched 130 miles from Ottawa to the city of Kingston, today's Rideau Canal. After considerable study and exploration of the local terrain, it was determined by government, I lost the term. Government sayers, that the best place to build this brand new canal would be right here. The best location for the entrance locks on land owned by Le Breton. Now we know that the land owned by Le Breton is today's Preston Street and Rochester Street. So the surveyors, that's the word, the surveyors understood that the low lay of the land, the swampiness of the Preston Ravine, as it was called back then, the natural gully that formed between the Ottawa River and Dow's Lake was a perfect spot to have a canal. Very low work needed to be done. Okay? But you know what happened. Though it was determined that the best location for the entrance locks on the Ottawa River would be just west of the Richland Landing, today's Preston Street, eventually it was determined by the government surveyors, the ones now sponsored in Dalhousie in England, that it would be a better drain if the canal would begin at Slay Bay. That is, right underneath Parliament Hill. So instead of starting the canal in swampy land, they decided to dynamite through all that rock because the land belonged to Dalhousie. And it was only government money anyway. And so the future canal, right? The future canal would be on land that had been purchased by Lord Dalhousie. And this was the vendetta on Le Breton. So that very beautiful future canal that draws tourists and that we love so much was all part of a lucrative constructive deal held by government agencies. With the canal underway, viable plans for the development of Bytown, any development of Rochesterville or the Preston Street area or the Breton Flats became a pipe dream until this very day. With the lucrative construction of the canal, all plans now moved towards the Locks area. Now, the Locks condemn the flats to an industrial backwater, which is what the Breton Flats and the area has been for the past 100 years. Indeed, the foundation of Bytown and its later becoming incorporated as the city of Ottawa in 1855 dates from the date that canal began, 26 September 1826. And Bytown became the incorporated town of Ottawa in 1855. But the flats and the land immediately south of Preston, of the flats, remain relevant. The first true city and suburb of the nascent, the very young city of Ottawa, was Rochesterville, just south of the flats. That's the area, we recall, which was formerly subdivided into sellable real estate lots by Rochester and Preston. They boasted of the area to legions of civil servants and corporate managers who wished to buy country homes. They purchased those country homes along Preston Street and the Rochester Street area. They purposely gave the names Spruce, Maple, Poplar, Balsam, Oak, Pine, Willow Streets to attract people to live in the country. Well, indeed, it was country back then. Okay. By the time you got into your carriage and got down to the Preston Street area or the Rochester Street area, it probably took a half hour to an hour, right? You're out in the country. The notion of country living within city limits was reinforced by those names, so that most of the area that we now consider Preston Street was developed between 1866 and 1890. The earliest contacts with Italians would be when Giovanni Caboto came to Canada in 1497. We can ascertain with relative certainty that some Italian migration from northern regions took place between 1850 and 1890. For the most part, they were seasonal workers. Came from the north and the south, and preferred to come to Canada rather than Switzerland, Austria, and France. Some, however, were professionals. Their masonry work and their skills was instrumental in the grand churches, the palazzi, in many of the bank buildings in the United States. Those of you that travel the States know that most of the old bank buildings are all Palladian style. And these are all from our first Italian immigrants who came to Canada and North America and brought with them these mason skills. It is estimated that between 1881 and 2000, that by 1881, over 2,000 Italians resided in Canada, primarily in Montreal, Toronto. Most work in construction and manufacturing. In the capital city of Ottawa, however, the situation was quite different. Ottawa has always been hampered by the fact that it is glacial, deep river valleys, and it is saddled, or was saddled, with one source economy, lumber, which eventually became government, which now is moving into, hopefully, high tech. The Italians who settled in Ottawa preferred to settle in Lower Town, and several Italian names speak to us still from the Sandy Hill area. Of note is the name Guttadaulia. A newly arrived immigrant, he operated a small convenience store on the corner of Nelson and Wilbrod Streets. In the 1881 census, 8 Italian households in the city of Ottawa for a total of 36 persons of Italian origin. And their names include Francis Biaggi, Stefano Moscardino, and John Marava. They represent the earliest immigrants to the city of Ottawa. No other city ward in 1881 census counted any Italian names. None were reported. There may have been, but none were reported. A particularly enterprising individual from this area was Frank Imbro. He opened a store in the Sandy Hill district in 1809, located at Rideau Street between Friel and Chapel Streets. It was an always crowded market. He served a European-style experience to the local English and French. Highly popular, a successful businessman. He eventually transformed his business into a restaurant and became a thriving restaurant. Some say the first Italian restaurant. But Madame Dinardo's Spaghetti House on the corner of Bank Street and Albert also contends to that title. When the store was renovated in 1954, the Ottawa Journal reported the expansion with great fanfare. Another name from the area, James Mandia, established himself on Dalhousie Street. While James Sasso and Sons became a fixture in the Byward Market. In 1901, you recognize La Bottega, right? That Sasso store, which eventually becomes La Bottega. Bottega di Gasto. In 1901, persons claiming Italian origin had increased to 305. By 1913, the number of households in Italia had increased to 150. The Italian community has expanded and is moving into the Preston Street area. We find sojourners, boarders, who now appear in Italian homes. The family name of Dominic and Mary Calculina contains 4 single male boarders of male origin. Now, some of you may have had boarders in their home. I remember we did when I was a young child. Our family in Detroit had 4 boarders in our home. We had a spare room. Boarders were simply men who were working here from Italy with no family and simply lived in your home. They slept in the home. My mother prepared their lunches and meals for them and washed their clothes. So they basically rented a room. Only rather in our house, rather than having only one fellow, we had 4 guys sleeping in a bed, which was fairly normal back then, I guess. But that's just the way it was. And so here you see them here. Calculina married, female, wife, mother, that's her birth date. Lipuma Salvatore, male, a lodger, you could call them, rather than a boarder as we call them. Single, there's his birth date, okay? And so, these are the census. So we are now at the point also of counting these individual workers. During this period, the first Italian grocery stores in Ottawa appeared. One of the very first ones in what we consider to be the Preston Street area is Francesco Guzzo and Pasquale Adamo. This is part of a handful of the first wave of Italian immigrants who settled in what was to become Little Italy.
Franco, there's the original cash register from Guzzo and Adamo. That was donated by the Adamo family, by Pat Adamo.
You see? Wonderful source, wonderful source. Fina is a wonderful source. Now, I spent just a bit on the family because Pasquale Adamo was one of those very few immigrants who knew English. Let's say he knew English and Italian. So his store became a popular point of contact for the Italian community, provided translations, provided interpretations, wrote and read letters for the illiterate. He was also an agent for the Bank of Naples and helped many Canadians routinely send money to their families in Italy. So now you see how the community is moving from simply having boarders, simply having lodgers, simply having people who work here, simply having entrepreneurs who are interested in selling goods. Now we have someone who wants to use some of his skills, good or not, but they were adequate, to send money to Italy, to write a letter, to read a letter, to open up a post office. Without that step, communities don't grow. There are communities where they're simply interested in making money and do nothing else, and they never evolve. They never have the clubs, they never have the centers. They simply remain what they are and peter out after a few generations. But our communities all over the world have tended to move upwards. At least we considered it an upward mobility. Those of us that can immediately begin to give of ourselves, which is the very first trait of any community. People who begin to write newspapers, help in translations, take someone to the store to help with a bank account. The local priest, where suddenly the church now becomes an agency. So you see how that works. And this is what the book is about. It's about how the community grows in this way and how it spirals. Eventually you get these small entrepreneurs that become big entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs that provide construction materials for huge companies, and you know the names, I won't make them. Without that, you don't have a sense of community. Once you've got that sense of community, how do you now go to another level? Well, you move into the political level. And we have with some of our local families. But you all know too that it's beginning to peter out. And that somehow we need to make it survive, if it can. Will it? I don't know. Not up to me. Up to future generations. But it's something that we need to speak of, it's something we need to know. These are the beginnings of this. Now, unlike many of his compatriots, he knew how to read and write, and he imparted this on his children, so that, especially Pasqualina, continued dedication to the community, continued community service, and faithfully provided countless hours of community work. Okay? Long after her father died in 1927. Then we have families such as George Calderone, known as the Dean of Ottawa Merchants. He opened his first store on the corner of Sussex and Rideau at the age of 16. The store didn't last very long, so he moved to his father's store at 215 Bank Street. And he remained behind the cash register for 65 years. He is one of the oldest and perhaps the most distinguished gentlemen to grace Ottawa, Rocco Antonio Graziadei. Distinguished because he was already a distinguished musician when he arrived in Italy.
Franco.
And there is.
That's the harp from the Graziadei trio.
Wow.
That dates back to 1880s. It was donated by the Graziadei family.
Tina's always pulling rabbits out of her hat. There'll be a few more, I'm sure.
Where's the Ferrari?
His Graziadei Orchestra was a fixture at all local events. But not only local events. He performed on Parliament Hill often. Performed for the Governor General in Rideau Hall. And due to his high profile and indefatigable activity, Rocco Graziadei was appointed the official agent for the Italian community by the Italian General Council. He remained in his position until his death in 1935. Tullio Locatelli, who was a cobbler, who began the first shoe repair shop on Preston Street, eventually moved to Elgin Street, where he specialized in orthopedic shoes for war veterans. I can run out of people to speak of here because there are just too many of them. And as I say, this is not a book about people. I just wanted to include a few tonight that I mentioned. But we cannot not mention the Costantini family. Giuseppe Costantini and Antonio Di Scipio were the original proprietors of the iconic, soon-to-be demolished. Yes. You should at least keep its storefront somewhere, do something with it. You know? This iconic Prescott Hotel. This is obviously a very small sampling of the peoples that have made Ottawa. Back to numbers. The numbers of Italians in Ottawa increased in the years after World War II. In 1941, 1,622 persons claiming Italian heritage lived in Ottawa. That number increased in 1951. Ottawa began receiving the bulk of its Italian immigration population between 1950 and 1970. With the years 1957 and 1958, it should be written for something, right? There we go. Yeah. Showing the greatest population. Okay. 80% of the newly arrived Italians were sponsored by relatives already living in Ottawa. 1961, 8,000 persons called Ottawa home. The decade of the 60s was the most prolific. For immigration, as numbers soared to 14,680 by 1971. Though earlier migration to Canada, to Ottawa was typically from the north, this majority came from Central South, primarily Abruzzo, Pretoro, Lapino, the Chietino area, and the southern regions of Calabria, Cleto, Cosenza, Reggio Calabria. Other regions included Lazio, Campania, Veneto, Piemonte, Molise, and Sicily, but they are represented to a much lower extent. Though some continue to settle in the Sandy Hill area, all this influx of new Italian immigrants to the Preston Street area begins what comes to be known as the village. Now, what came to be known as the village lies at the bottom of the escarpment that is Parliament Hill. It is bounded by the Brenton Flats along the Ottawa River, north the Carling Avenue, Dow's Lake, west the Bayswater area, including St. Lawrence and Ottawa Railway, now the old train, and limited to the east by Bronson Avenue. That is your Dalhousie ward. That is what is considered to be the village, at least when I spoke to the old villagers. When walking on Preston Street, beginning from its northern beginning and moving towards Carling, even the casual observer is struck by its material separateness now, as you can see, from the rest of the city. The side streets boast tall, narrow, clapboard structures. The better part of the existing buildings were built between the 1905 and 1920. And the structures were just that, very basic clapboard buildings that were normally added onto. If you had a son and married, you just added onto the home and kept adding onto the homes. Okay. The family was and remains family-oriented. Although there is a movement towards childless couples, empty nesters, but more on this point later. The population once consisted solely of large families. Some of these children are now adults. Some of them returned to the area. Some of them have set up shop in the area in many of these older homes. And so the site is restlessly feeding and feeding off of its urban gentrification. Now, the world I'm speaking of is a mostly vanished world. these turn-of-the-century diaspora buildings. The families which defined the space, the Nassos, the Pantalone, the Benechini. It was a space that was identified with labor. It was a space that was identified with school, with obligation, with community events, with religious festivities. Beautiful Sunday dinners served after Mass at St. Anthony's. I have to tell you, though, that the area was never really fully Italian. That's always been a myth. The environs surrounding the area were full of Irishmen, Englishmen, Poles, Ukrainians, Greeks, and the newly arriving Italians. And we know this because of the parishes in the area, which still bear the names of their ethnicity. The area was divided into parishes, each pastor in friendly competition with the other. Polish Church on Rochester Street, Greek Church, Gladstone, St. Mary's Irish Church on Bayswater, St. Gerard, French congregation on Beach Street, St. Jean-Baptiste, located on Booth and Empress. A typical street, like Rochester, according to Nola Ferguson, who lived on the block, and I'm quoting her, consisted on our side of the street of two Jewish families, a tailor and a grocer, a Lebanese pie and donut maker, two French, a butcher and a livery stable, one Italian, three English, plus the blue Jewish grocer also being a shoe repairman. On the corner was a blacksmith, next to him another shoe repair, a Ukrainian church. In relative terms, however, over the 1950s, persons of French, Irish, and English origin were decreasing at a fast rate. On the other hand, the Italian component of the area was growing at a whopping 250%. In 1951, the inhabitants claimed 440. 1961, 1,400. So this increasing concentration sure was pushing people out of their homes, but you still have these members of former communities, the Lebanese pie maker and the Greek shoemaker and the Ukrainian parish, still there. They're not going anywhere. Okay. Why? Well, the area had no real factory, no heavy industry. Many of the immigrants worked at the Carling O'Keefe Brewery, formerly called Bradding's Brewery. Others worked at Pure Springs, located on Aberdeen. Smith Transport, beside Pure Spring plant, provided further employment, as did All Fuels, former coal yard with a coal shed, Sturger Coal, located at 333 Preston. One of the more popular stores in the area, however, was the Chiarelli's family store. Frank Chiarelli, the first of the Chiarelli born in Canada, recalls the village feeling of living in the area. All the action seemed to take place in the 6-block area around our store. That was my neighborhood, my little Italy. Now, besides my wealth of information, my encyclopedia here of knowledge next to me, the other person that gave me a feeling of the heart of the area too was Frank Chiarelli. He still lives the village street on his skin. He still lives it. Okay, you can feel it when he speaks. The store that he is referring to belonged to his father, was named Eugenio Chiarelli and Son. It was both a grocery and a butcher shop, and was located on the corner of Rochester and Pavilla Streets. And as Frank likes to say, we weren't part of the Preston Street area. We were the village. We were the village. We were up here. Okay. Now, the area in front of the store, according to Frank, was a hangout for neighborhood youth like Frank. They all played hockey, they played baseball in the field, they dropped snowballs in the smokestacks of passing trains, and they used to hang off the railway pass on Preston Street just for fun. Many of them became stars. Frank himself is a four-time All-Star, All-American, and still holds 3 Division I scoring titles. There was a sense, he says, of being different from the rest of the city. The corner crowd, comprised of guys from the area, gave us a feeling of solidarity and poverty. We seemed to live in a movie set where destiny privileged the quick and the bold. We were always getting into trouble. But then again, who wasn't? The Carelli family, as we know, boasts many such notable people. I mentioned only 2 of them. You could read who they are, but I'm sure you know them. Members of the family pursued a broad range of professional callings. Others in the area became cooks, some opened restaurants. Many of you will remember Chappie's Restaurant, which was the first restaurant on Preston Street. The family business became a landmark, known to all, visited by young and old, especially after Mass. People tell me that they can still smell Mary's famous spaghetti and meatballs. It closed its doors in 1956. Albert, known as Chappie, was son to Antonio Caramarigo and his wife Maria Napolitano. They had immigrated from the small dwellings of Ilipateatina to live in Camden, New Jersey. He was born in America, but he liked sport. An amateur boxer, wrestler, and student of jiu-jitsu, Chappie was also a member of the Indians, the Norman and Preston Street baseball team. And his passion for sport led him to form one of Ottawa's very first sports clubs, the Preston Athletic Club, with good friend Henry Menechini, 1919. Now, he wasn't alone in his pursuit of sports. This is the gang that Chappie and Frank used to hang with. And I've only placed 4 or 5 names there. There are pages and pages of guys from Preston Street who became semi-pro, and some of them, as you can see, pro boxers, pro wrestlers. Some of them changed their names, as many of them do. Okay? Guys like Fred Pinky Mitchell, Gail Gerwin. Okay? So places like Chappie's Lunch and Chiarelli's became places where the neighborhood grew from a sports venue point of view. The neighborhood thus was coalescing. The growing Italian community in the area of Rochester now preferred to call itself the Village. Life in the village was good. People were content, upwardly mobile. Officially, until the Preston Street Urban Renewal Study, 1962. The Building Condition Survey studied each property, addressed each one, and ranked them good, fair, poor, very poor, and given a score in the coefficiency range. I'm reading it as a computer because the tabulations were all performed by a computer. This produced a target of 8 square blocks bounded by Balsam, Booth, Preston Street, and train tracks. Residents were generally not contacted, nor their opinions sought. Families were uprooted, forced to relocate, not rehoused in their own neighborhoods once the projects were completed. Over 1,200 individual buildings were condemned, expropriated, and demolished. All of the businesses in the commercial blocks on Preston Street were cleared away. All of the businesses on Preston Street were cleared away. Imagine. Only 111 new houses were built at the end of it all. The following overhead picture shows the Preston Street neighborhood in 1958. Here it is after demolition, 1965. There are very few streets and buildings that escaped urban renewal. Here are a few of them. I'll go through them very, very quickly for you. You know them all. They're all still there. Grant Electric Board. They've all been transformed somehow, turned into something else. Rochester looking south. like looking at the cars. Preston Street looking north on Gladstone. A lot of these confectioneries are still there, taken over by the Vietnamese or the Orientals, but some are still there. Yeah, we recognize that. This is easily recognized, obviously. Many of them transformed. Interesting when you see the community over the years and how it has indeed changed. Looking up Louisa Street.
Wow. Sure.
Now, the demolition of so many buildings, that were actually sound and that could have been rehabilitated, was definitely a poor investment. Nevertheless, 1971 report presented a positive outcome to the renewal. A derelict neighborhood had been refurbished. It had been refurbished to include a high school complex, a nun's residence, and a senior citizens apartment tower. This would enhance property values, according to the politicians, instill a new sense of pride in the Italian community. The people were sold, stimulated, should stimulate the local economy, should help establish businesses and attract new ones. The overall reaction, as you all know because you lived this period, was completely different. Paolo Ferrero, outspoken activist, pastor of St. Anthony's Church, felt at the time that planners should have come up with a scheme that would have kept some of the long-established families used to owning their own homes in the area. From his office windows, he would look down towards the area once known as Rochester Heights, where some of those people had lived. The popular priest believed that a real vacuum cleaner was used to gut the neighborhood and to create one without community, without spirit, without tradition, and without friendship. Frank Chiarelli, it felt like the heart had been pulled out of the community. Longtime friends and neighbors and hangouts just suddenly disappeared. So instead of bettering the area, the dream of ongoing renewal especially worsened the area for years to come. The area remained, as you know, relatively stagnant, devoid of genuine economic hope, dwindling local clientele, parking lots. Arriving on Preston in the 70s and 80s, one was struck by the grayness, limp landscape, upscale indifference. Many families have moved away. Those that remained had little energy to build new businesses that seemed headed towards a dead-end future. What indeed, if anything, could an Italian-Canadian community do to recreate Preston Street? Well, the street now is becoming populated with business parks that have nothing to do with anything that's Italian or Italian-Canadian. When the street has become populated with business parks, and when it is being marketed as Little Italy Chinatown, what is there to do? Little Italy Chinatown is a diverse neighborhood, we are told, with sleek infill houses and new condos, and often sitting side by pre-war homes, rooming houses, and rental apartments. If you wish more information, go to West Centertown, no longer Little Italy. What are we going to do with that sign? You see the marketing strategies here. The ad goes on to say that if you want information, you can go to the Ottawa neighborhood, Little Italy Chinatown, also called West Centertown. Today, as Preston Street moves into its Little Italy Chinatown phase, the community needs to ask itself, what will it do? What will it do indeed? I ask again. When newer enclaves of Italians have moved to what has been called the New Italy. What indeed does Preston Street matter? Today, as Preston Street moves beyond its ethnic past and incorporates an amalgamated future, there's a different kind of heart that is beating in the center. According to plans, a vibrant village will sprout up in Little Italy, New China, in the coming years. Multi-million-dollar youth development projects. And so, just as lumber, fire, and politics, Dalhousie, Preston, and politics and money had created the areas of Bytown and Rochesterville, so too politicians, big business, and gentrification will recreate the area that we once knew as the village. Intensification will transform the neighborhood in ways we scarcely know imaginable. Bountifully colored sidewalks, new major investments, new coffee shops, boutique grocery stores to pick up your latte as you go to your 45th floor Claridge Icon apartment overlooking Dow's Lake will detail the future cityscape. And it will be a beautiful cityscape, I'm sure. A wonderfully gentrified area that opens up onto a Libretton Flats with the Ottawa Senators Arena and all the new buildings which will be going on the flats, and it will indeed be a vibrant area of the city. No doubts about it. But where are you going to eat your Italian sausage? Does it? The question is, does it matter? Does it matter? Because if it had mattered, this wouldn't have happened. And so it didn't matter. That's the point. The historical and social niceties that rendered this area a haven for a pseudo-ethnic pride, slowly slipping into the trendiness of gentrified living and brogue-heeled hipsters and latte-sipping bohemians. Boutique condos, pubs will replace friendly barbershops, diners, storefronts, and become upscale vanilla businesses that you can find anywhere in America. The transformation of the village into colorless, square, sustainable development is on the horizon, is actually here. Beyond the relatively innocuous and late-coming signage that wishes to express a newfound Italian-Canadian pride, has no roots, is not really culturally defined. It just sits there on a street corner, waiting for someone to read it. Who the hell's going to read it? Some tourist that walk by with some tourist guide that says, oh, this is to this and this is to that. That's not the sense of the area, unfortunately. Though it can be said that many other urban centers in the city of Ottawa are just the same. There's nothing new. I'm not chiding the community. I'm simply saying this is par for the course. Every single community, College Street, Saint Laurent area, Preston Street area, my area in Detroit, they're all latte, they're all hot latte and sausages now, and they're moving into gentrified brogue boutiques. Every single one of them. It's a sign of the times. Preston Street and its surrounding area will continue its pace of evolution and continue on its way. The arrival of encroaching bike lanes, towering Riverview apartments, speculative investors, cookie-cutter chain stores are destroying the neighborhood and its authenticity. All the things that made the area are no longer in the area. It will indeed become a viable space, a wonderful space, as I say, to live. But what will happen once we live here in these towers? What will happen to this? Will it grow in the process? Will it remain distant from its uprooted roots? I mean, this only takes place once every 4 years anyway, or once every 2 years. What's going to happen? Is it real? Or is it just a moment of waving a flag? I mean, Italy's not in the World Cup this year. So now what? We support Canada, definitely. If we are to sustain, and I'm about to finish here, if we are to sustain a genuine Italian culture in the city of Ottawa, each individual must feel the need to fulfill the community's potential by expressing its own uniqueness in its stores, in its boutiques, in its ways of eating, in its ways of living, and in its ways, which the community center here is one of them, historical center, of creating larger multicultural networks. The Italian community needs to develop long-standing institutions. We need to revive a lot of our clubs, difficult to do. We need to sustain Villa Marconi. We need to sustain the churches one way or another, the businesses, in order to ingrain in our youth at elementary age, and in order to give our older people at their age, okay, a sense of what these symbols mean. Yes, they are Vespas. Yes, they are Ferraris. Yes, they are two, I guess, soccer players there. But what does it mean? What do they instill? What can they teach our children about ourselves? A community's future, the future of Corso Italia, Preston Street, lies in its youth, in their real understanding of their own culture, in understanding that there was a past, in understanding that these shadows remain with us, that to be an Italian and an Italian Canadian is their willingness to hold hands with their past, but not while eating pizzas and lattes and not understanding. Not by walking down these streets once a year while eating a panino and not understanding the future on Preston Street. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
You were great.
Thank you, Franco.